forgive the branding here, but the idea is to try and make it a little bit more exciting instead of like, and here are all of these regulatory proceedings. But we're going to start at the beginning. In 2019, New York passed and codified the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. Many of you on this call were a tremendous part of making this law a reality. Mountain Keeper joined with our New York Renews partners in this fight to get the bill through the legislature over a number of years and then across the finish line and signed by then Governor Cuomo. So the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act is what is setting the framework for everything that New York State is going to be doing to address the climate crisis. But what it won't do is just make it all happen because it's the law. Unfortunately, that's not how laws work. But what it does is lay out these really important nation-leading benchmarks that New York's going to have to reach. So first one of those is that we're going to be working toward a carbon neutral economy with reducing at least 85% of our emissions before 1990 levels by 2050. We're going to work to have some interim benchmarks, bring down our greenhouse gas emission levels by 40% by 2030. And we're going to work toward 100% zero emissions electricity by 2040. We're also aiming for benchmarks of 70% renewable electricity by 2030, 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035, 6,000 megawatts of distributed solar by 2025, 3,000 energy storage by 2030. And the law also includes strong commitments to climate justice and a just transition. The law directed the state to identify what are known as disadvantaged communities, also sometimes referred to as DACs, for the areas in our state that are going to be prioritized for investment for greenhouse gas reductions and for co-pollutant reductions. And anytime we're talking about, greenhouse gas emissions, we're talking about, they don't get released in a vacuum. It's because generally we're burning something. And so when we're releasing greenhouse gases, it's also releasing what are called co-pollutants. These are typically really, really dangerous. And anybody who is breathing today, and I do hope you all are, or has been for the last couple of days, knows exactly what co-pollutants are. Not only are we facing some of the worst air quality that the East Coast has ever seen as a result of the wildfires in Canada, it's also all of this fine particulate matter that gets into the air that makes it hard to breathe, that causes serious illnesses. And these types of pollutants, this decreased air quality, these breathing problems are, just battles that New Yorkers living in disadvantaged communities have been living with for decades. And so centering climate justice, centering environmental justice and disadvantaged communities at on this law is just so incredibly important, because we need to move forward in a way that's equitable and just. And so with that, I also just want to say, I hope everybody is well out there in the face of wildfires. Take care of yourself and others. And we will get through, and we will get on to working to make sure that we're reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, that we are moving forward with real climate solutions to try to reduce these impacts as the world evolves. All right. So come on, there we are. So one of the things that we talk about a lot at Mountain Keeper and New York Renews and in other spaces is implementing the climate law. We need to implement this law because, as I just said, having a law that tells us that we need to reduce all of our greenhouse gas emissions, we need to hit these targets, that's not going to just happen because somebody wrote it down and it's now part of the environmental conservation law. In order to make that law real, it's got to be implemented. And so there are a number of of things that have to happen in order to make this real. And that's what we mean by implementing. And I just want to give a big, huge hat tip to my colleague, Stefan Adel over at New York Renews, who helped put this framework together. But one of the things we need is attention from the governor and regulators. The governor and her regulatory agencies are going to be the enforcers and the ones who carry this whole ball forward. So when we're talking about regulatory agencies, we're talking about the Department of Environmental Conservation, the Department of Transportation, the Department of State, Department of Health, all of the agencies. Our climate law says that every agency in New York State has to get on board. Every agency in New York State has to do its part to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Some agencies will have a bigger piece of this than others, but every part of the state mechanism has to be working towards these goals. So, and that's not going to happen unless the governor directs it, because the governor is the top of all of the state agencies. Everybody there reports to her. So if this is not given the attention by the governor's office and the top brass, these will be words on the page. And that's going to be the end of it. I think many of us here who have been working on environmental issues for a while can think of far too many laws that, there was a ton of promise that haven't come to be because they didn't get the attention, they didn't get the funding, they didn't get the implementation that they really need. So that's the first step. We need attention. We need focus on this. The second is that these agencies need to write the rules. So the legislature passes law, and then regulatory agencies write rules and regulations. And those rules and regulations, they carry the force of law because they're what's used to make the law real. However, these are the real nitty gritty pieces. The law sets the framework, the rules and regs set how do we make this happen? So we got to write the rules. And then we have to fully fund and staff the programs, because again, this kind of goes with attention. If New York State does not invest, it does not put money behind making sure that we've got the experts and the technical people in the chairs to write the rules, to enforce the laws, again, this is not going to go anywhere. And then we need active public participation, especially if we always need that, right? On any of the laws that the state passes, but especially in this case, the climate transition that we are living through is going to impact every single one of us. It's going to impact some people more than others. But at the end of the day, every New Yorker is going to be part of making our climate future, our greenhouse gas emission free future, our healthier, cleaner, better green jobs future part of the reality. So making sure that the people who are impacted are going to be part of designing what the rules are is incredibly important. So from here on out, I'm going to be talking a lot more about the nitty gritty of what's happening this summer to implement the law. But I think it's really important to keep these four big points high in our minds about what do we really need to implement the law. We need all of these pieces working together in order for this to become reality, and in order for us to get the climate future that we need and deserve. So when we're talking about the hot climate summer, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about an avalanche of rules, regulations, paperwork, bureaucracy, and everything else. So there's a lot happening, and they're happening on the same timelines. First of all, New York State is going to be moving forward with regulations to design a cap and invest program. And I'm going to get into that in a little bit more detail in a couple minutes, but that's going to be a main driver for how the state reduces our greenhouse gas emissions. So that's incredibly important. Going along with that, when the legislature and governor passed this year's budget, one of the things they determined was okay, we're going to need to figure out how to make sure consumers benefit from any cap and invest regulations and any cap and invest program. And so they tasked the Department of Environmental Conservation, the New York State Energy Development and Research Authority, or NYSERDA, Tax and Finance, and 3 other state agencies that aren't coming to mind, to work together to come out with this report about how to make sure consumers benefit from the transition. The Public Service Commission has, for reasons that are completely unclear to me in this moment, determined that now is the time to go down the path of defining what zero emissions actually means. Because remember, going back a couple here, we're going to, the law says we have to get to 100% zero emissions electricity by 2040. So, we got a little bit of time here. The Public Service Commission, or the PSC, has determined that it's going to start figuring out how do you define what zero emissions is. And this is one of those things that could probably make us all totally crazy if you think too long about it, because on face value, we know what zero emissions means. But when you get into the technicalities, when you get into, the defining this legally, there's going to be a ton of funny business and wrangling. And that's exactly what we're seeing. We've got a group of that represents essentially big polluters in the nuclear industry who had asked the Public Service Commission to start the work to define this now because they wanted to benefit. They want to make sure that their type of energy production is defined as zero emissions. Or perhaps their technology, such as carbon capture and sequestration, which brings with a ton of environmental concerns and community concerns, frankly, making sure that those things are also considered part of what is zero emissions in New York State. So that proceeding is just completely rife with the potential for funny business, and that just kicked off. The Building Codes Council is revisiting its codes, code being another fancy word for rules or regulations. But the budget this year included mandates for all new buildings to be to be all electric. And so now that the law says that, because the budget's the law, the legislature passed that. So now that the law says that, the Codes Council has to figure out how it revises its building codes to drive that forward. So that's launching soon. The Public Service Commission is going to be doing another proceeding, this one around affordability and looking at the affordability needs and interests and how do we keep this affordable. And one thing I would point out is affordable for whom, but that's all going to be going forward. And then finally, and this is the one that's probably, going to just happen, under the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the Climate Action Council had to come out with a scoping plan, which helped to drive this process as well. That scoping plan has a lot of these details in it that the regulations are going to be drawn from. This was like a research report with a lot of public input over the last year or so. So that was released, and under the climate law, once that report is out, we have to then adjust our state energy plan so that it incorporates the scoping plan. That's something that is hopefully, if there's no funny business, that will just happen when the State Energy Board releases its plan. So, but that's coming up too. So this is all happening. It's all happening now. And it's going to be incredibly impactful. And it's one of those things where it's like, this is a great place where you could get, totally lost in the weeds, but there are no better weeds to be in because this is where it's all going to happen. What happened to my slide? Okay, I'll worry about that later. There are 3 big points, though, that I hope you take away from this as we move forward throughout all of these different proceedings. There are 3 things that we have to be doing. We have to protect the climate law from attacks and from false solutions. False solutions being carbon capture and sequestration, being a whole rainbow of different hydrogen options, many of which create emissions and do not get us out of the climate crisis. Things like that. So first of all, we've got to protect it. And then we also have to protect it from attacks and rollbacks, which are going to be coming from every angle. And all of these regulatory proceedings, again, have lots of opportunities for folks who do not have our best interests at heart, right? The gas and oil industry, who wants to keep their profits driving, even though they are the most profitable industry in human history ever. They're going to be looking to work any system they possibly can to roll back the requirements. So we've got to go on the defense even as we move the ball forward. Secondly, we've got to fully fund the law. If we do not put dollars behind words, we will not have programs that change anything. So this is fully funding is incredibly important. And third, we got to make sure that the agencies that are out there doing this work are equitably implementing the law, so that as we again move forward in New York State, we're doing so with climate justice at the center, and we're making sure that people who have been harmed by decades of poor environmental decisions are the ones that we're prioritizing to move forward in this transition. So equitably and effectively. But why now? I just want to go fishing. It's a beautiful summer. The Catskills. This is where, you can see me there in my waders. Everything is happening right now because the Climate Action Council came out with its draft scoping plan, or excuse me, its final scoping plan at the end of last year. And that document is what all of the rest of the law's implementation is based on. That's the real foundation. And so that was kind of the starting gun at the beginning of this race. Now that the law is out, or excuse me, now that the law and also that scoping plan is out and we have this foundation, now it's on the regulatory agencies to move this forward. Additionally, the climate law, when we passed that in 2019, we said we're not going to sit around and wait until the 12th of never to make this happen. There are dates and deadlines in there to move everything forward, and recognizing that there is no time to waste. That's why this is all happening now. So it's a confluence of different factors, and it just means that 2023 is our year to win. Oh, and now I have animation. Evo, can I get a thumbs up that this is working? Great. Okay, so here we go. Cap and invest, cap, trade, and invest. There are different ways to talk about this. This is the one that I'm going to start with because, again, if we're looking at both kind of range of impacts and what's important, cap and invest is going to have a huge outcome, or a huge impact on the outcomes. So the Climate Action Council took direction from the law, came up with their scoping plan. And one of the things they had to do in their scoping plan was to advise the state on what's the best way to move forward with reducing greenhouse gas emissions. This Climate Action Council came back and said, cap and invest. That's the way to do it. So a cap and invest program is, also known as cap and trade. That's why I threw the trade up there. It kind of depends on what jurisdiction you're in. But it is, basically the concept is we're going to put a cap on the amount of greenhouse gas emissions in New York State. And then we're going to require regulatory entities to purchase allowances that they can turn in, to emit greenhouse gases up to that cap. And this is going to be an economy-wide cap. So everybody emitting together, all the allowances together cannot exceed the greenhouse gas emission cap. And those allowances will be equal to a certain amount of carbon dioxide equivalents, right? So we're going to have a cap. You're going to have to, regulated entities are going to have to purchase allowances to come in. And then we're going to invest that money in New York State. So in order to make this work, there are a couple, and I'm going to hit the super high notes here, because this is, again, we're going to get way into the weeds as this regulatory process goes over. But big picture, to make this work, number one, we have to have a cap that's coming down annually. It's got to be real. We can't just math this to make it work, right? We need to have a cap that is actually driving emissions reductions. All polluters, all sectors are going to have to be included in that cap. And we may want to consider lower caps for emissions in disadvantaged communities. Again, because greenhouse gas emissions and co-pollutants, which cause massive health problems, are inexorably linked. Having lower greenhouse gas emission requirements in thresholds in disadvantaged communities means that there will also be less carbon dioxide emitted there, less co-pollutants emitted there, and they work hand in hand. Second thing, for when it comes to purchasing allowances, the DEC and NYSERDA right now are proposing that that entities will purchase allowances based on an auction, and then with those allowances, they could trade with each other in order to, essentially game the system so that certain entities could keep polluting, others could, while others could make some money selling allowances, frankly. So this should not be allowed. Trading in every other jurisdiction that has trading has led to hotspots. And those hotspots are where we've got concentrated pollution. And guess what? They're almost always in disadvantaged communities. So trading should not be allowed. We should be including co-pollutants when we're considering allowances, and they have to be right priced. If we're going to use a cap and invest or a cap and trade system to drive down greenhouse gas emissions, the allowances have to be expensive enough to change behavior. They also have to be expensive enough to generate enough money to invest in climate solutions. So that's the last part of this, the invest side. Make sure that we're taking those dollars that are generated and putting them into climate solutions. Nowhere else. This has to be the focus. It has to be the priority. We have to send money to disadvantaged communities and invest in solutions in those areas. And we need to invest in a broad range of real solutions to help us address the climate crisis. We need money for consumers. There's going to be fiscal impacts here. So the state is going to be doing this report about providing consumer benefits. And this is something where Mountain Keeper is going to be following closely as our partners at New York Renews. So Cap and Invest is going to be a big priority this summer. And then this report is also going to be a big priority because we need to do this right as well. Number one, we need to make sure that consumers see enough benefits to actually both change behavior and to support households as we make this transition, because we are talking about swapping out appliances, we're talking about swapping out systems. So making sure that there's support for that is incredibly important to making this effective and making it equitable. So money for consumers, we're going to be keeping a close eye on that report. We're also going to be working with the Bond Act. This is a little bit outside because it's not a directly related to CLCPA proceeding that's happening right now. But this summer, guess what? DEC is also working to figure out how to spend $4.2 billion across New York State. You all voted for that last year. Yay, round of applause for you. Thank you. And now we need to put that money out into the communities. This little quote here about what Bond Act funding will do for the climate is pulled right from DEC's website. They are doing a listening tour this summer to get folks' feedback about what to invest Bond Act money in specifically. So if you have projects, especially climate projects that you want to have funded in your community, go talk to DEC. They're listening. There's an online listening session on June 26th. And then that little link, which I'll also send out with the notes after this call, will get you to their list of events. Many of them are in person. None of them are in the Catskills, but there is that virtual one. And then we're also going to be looking at what's coming next. Like I said, consumer reports, a report about consumer benefits is due by January 1 of next year. The exact timeline of how that plays out to be determined. Building Council regulations, they have a meeting coming up on June 23rd. You can attend virtually or in Albany, New York, or Buffalo. If you care about electric buildings and you want to see the Building Council start moving in the right direction, please go to that meeting. You can sign up and get a 2 to 3 minute spot to share your views. You do not have to be a technocratic expert to go and say, I want the Building Council to adopt codes that is good, they're going to drive all electric buildings in New York State. Make that happen. So if you've got some time on that day, please do. You can find more information. Again, I'll send a link out after this, but from the Building Council's website. Sometime this year, the scope and plan will be adopted into the energy plan. Again, stay tuned. This should be fairly pro forma. If it's not, we'll let you know. And then right now, NYSERDA and DEC are doing a series of webinars about what is going to shape the cap and invest regulations. These are really deep in the weeds, technical webinars. There's a whole series of topics you can hop on, ask questions, and view. I've gotten a lot of feedback from folks that DEC is not answering all of the questions that come in on this, but which is certainly disappointing. But you can at least see what they're thinking about there. The Cap and Invest public comment period, separate from these webinars right now, which are just stakeholder engagement and kind of kicking the tires on some concepts. An actual draft regulations and public comment period is coming later this summer, August, September, somewhere in there. Exact timeline to be determined, but under the law, the state has to finalize these by the end of the year. And the Public Service Commission zero emissions proceeding comment deadline is July 17th, 2023. Again, you do not have to be a technical expert to tell the Public Service Commission no false solutions. Do not allow, insert your favorite false solution here to be counted as a zero emission technology. So that's all coming this summer. And then lastly, I wanted to leave you with a quote that I've been holding close in my heart, especially these last several days while we've been dealing with the smoke from the wildfires, which is absolutely exacerbated by the climate crisis. Governor Jay Inslee, we're the first generation to feel the impact of climate change and the last generation that can do something about it. So I just talked at you and dealt with bad technology for 33 minutes. Almost without breathing. I apologize for that. But at the end of the day, I hope what you take away from this is there are so many ways you can be impactful this summer, and we need you there. We need to show up, let these agencies know what we need from them, and hold them accountable. Woo! So with that, I'm going to stop the screen share. And I will say, does anybody want to chat about any of this? Is there anything you want to get into a bit deeper? Is there anything that I didn't touch on? Is there anything that's totally confusing? How can I help, if anything? Or if you're just like, man, that was brilliant. That's cool too. Awesome. Hannah's got a question about funding. Hannah, did we set it up right so that you can take yourself off mute and ask?
I think so. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Thanks. Go ahead, Hannah.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of actions. Well, first of all, thank you for taking the time to put this together. But I've seen a lot of actions over the last few years about fully funding the CLCPA. And I mean, I know that New York Renews does a lot of action on this. And I was just curious because I think NYSERDA has a recommendation for, is it 10 million a year?
10 billion with a B.
10 billion a year. Yeah, 10 billion a year. And I was just curious what actually ended up in this year's budget, like specifically allocated to fund the CLCPA, if anyone knows that number, and kind of what the progress is with funding and how that actually like is written in the yearly budgets. So yeah, that's my question.
Well, thank you for that question. Thank you very much, because this is one of my favorite topics. Because I truly believe, like, you want to talk about the state's priorities, great, show me the money and I'll show you our priorities. So when the state legislature finalized the budget this year, there was no additional on budget funding specifically for the CLCPA. Lots of different climate programs at DEC got funding for this and that. DEC got more staffing this year. Some good things happened, but there was no specific like earmarked funding for CLCPA implementation. What we did get was a framework going forward, which is going to capture all of the money from any Cap and Invest program. And that was called the Climate Action Fund. And so it said any money coming in from Cap and Invest is going to have to go to the Climate Action Fund. It said any dollars in the Climate Action Fund have to be spent on on climate programs, which, believe it or not, we had to fight for, but I'm thrilled to say we won that fight. And then it also broke it down. It said at least 30% of that fund goes to consumer benefits, and then the other 67% go toward can go toward climate programs, like very vaguely defined, and 3% goes to small industrial businesses, which is not defined and so a little unclear. But so that gives us the funding. So depending on how a cap and invest program is set up is going to be the outcome of how much money goes into that pot. Going forward, there are a couple ways this could happen. First of all, the state could just say, okay, great, 67% can go toward climate programs, and we're just going to write a massive check to DEC and NYSERDA for them to go and spend that 67%. Good job. God bless. We think that's the absolute wrong way to do it. The legislature can also do line item appropriations and say, of this money, this much needs to go toward electric school buses, and this much needs to go toward making communities more heat resistant, and this much. So you can get much more nitty gritty, and that's going to be the fight next year, and that's going to be the fight every year thereafter, is protecting that funding, making sure it goes out the door, and making sure that it's allocated in the right ways. So I'm excited to be working with you all for the next 100 years to make sure that this all gets fully funded.
Thanks for that. Just one follow-up question.
Yeah, sure.
Where does the actual cap and invest stand at the moment? Is that actually enacted? Is that just on the table? Like where is that?
So since the legislature, since the climate law says that DEC has to come up with a program to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, DEC has said, and NYSERDA has said, the cap and invest program is the way forward. And so because they have that discretion under the law, they now move forward with regulations to make this real. So that's everything that's happening this summer. Right now, they're doing those webinars to ask technical questions about how do we even design this. And then later this summer, they're going to have a public comment period where everybody will get to see the draft regulations and then weigh in on those. And then I see Sarah dropped in the chat, who will be updating us about developments as they occur, public testimony and cap and invest. So you'll hear from Mountain Keeper. This is one of the things I think many of you are on our email list. We will certainly be putting the word out about this. We also work hand in glove with New York Renews, which is the state's Climate Justice Coalition, 350 organizations strong, that's fighting for climate and climate justice. So either of those places are our mailing lists are great places to be on, and you'll get more information as the summer unfolds. What else you got? Cool. Well, I'm going to stay on until the last person signs off. So if anybody wants to chat but just doesn't feel like being in a big public forum is your jam, I'll be here. And otherwise, I will see you all soon. Hannah just asked, would it be accurate to say there's no funding at all in the state budget specifically for the CLCPA? Yeah, I think you could say that. I think if the governor's office were to respond, they'd say, well, but look at this climate funding over here, and we did this and we did that too. From New York Renews and Catskill Mountain Keepers' point of view, that's what we would say is like, no, like you did not make the major investments. NYSERDA says we need up to $10 billion a year. So, you know, what is there is good, and we applaud that. And also, no, like you need to fully fund the CLCPA.